Negotiations collapse. Humanity walks away, and the galaxy begins to fear what comes next. The station was called Concord Ring. It floated in neutral space between three solar systems, owned by no one and maintained by everyone, or at least by the 7 species that called themselves the Galactic Compact. It was a large structure built from pale metal and dark glass, and it hummed quietly the way all big machines do when they're working without anyone noticing. Delegations from dozens of worlds had passed through its corridors over the centuries. Wars had been stopped here. Treaties had been signed here. Species had begged for protection here and walked away grateful. Humanity had been here before, twice, and both times they had walked away with nothing. This was the third time. Calvin Rose sat at the long table, conference room 7, and looked at the ceiling for a moment before the session began. He was not a tall man. He had short brown hair going gray at the sides and the kind of face that did not give much away. He had spent 11 years learning how to read alien expressions and how to make sure they could not read his. He wore a plain dark suit, no medals, no pins, no flags on his lapels. He had decided a long time ago that symbols were for people who needed to be reminded of what they stood for. Beside him sat Dr. Laura Finch. She was thin and quick-eyed, with dark hair pulled back in a small notebook open in front of her, even though everything was being recorded. Laura had spent 20 years studying alien languages, and she understood things about the Compact's member species that most humans did not even know to ask about. She wrote in her notebook not because she needed to remember things, but because writing helped her think. On Calvin's other side sat Colonel Garrett Pierce. Garrett was built like someone had designed him to stand in doorways and make people reconsider their decisions. He had broad shoulders, a clean uniform, and he had been given strict orders. Observe, say nothing, and only speak if someone addressed him directly. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and his eyes moving slowly around the room. Across the table sat 7 aliens. The Vreth lead ambassador was named Saul Vreth. He was tall, thin, with gray-blue skin, and 4 fingers on each hand. He had been a diplomat for 60 years by his species count, which made him older than most human governments. He had long, narrow eyes that blinked sideways, and when he spoke, his translator device turned his clicks and low tones into flat, careful English. The others represented the Solon hegemony, the Dor, the Ashan collective, the Cathar, the Marevi, and the Thau. They sat in a curved row, each slightly different in shape and color, each carrying the calm and settled weight of civilizations that had existed for thousands of years before the first human had ever looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there. The room itself was designed to be neutral. The chairs were adjusted for each species. The lighting was set to a level that none of them found too bright or too dark. The temperature had been calculated to a compromise that left everyone slightly uncomfortable, which was considered fair. There were no windows. There were no decorations. There was only the table and the beings sitting around it, and the long history of everything that had brought them here. Sol Vreth began speaking at exactly the scheduled time. He did not waste words. He laid out the Compact's offer in a clear, organized way, and his voice was polite and smooth. This was, he explained, a generous offer, the result of many months of internal discussion among the compact's full council. Humanity, formally listed in compact records as observed species 12, was being invited to become an associate member. Calvin listened without moving. The terms came one by one. No voting rights on compact law. No access to Tier 2 or Tier 3 technology. Mandatory inspection rights for all human military vessels anywhere in or near compact space. A 10% tithe of Earth's full economic output paid annually into a fund called the Species Stabilization Reserve, which was managed and controlled entirely by the Compact's Administrative Council. In return, humanity would receive access to compact trade routes of protection, guarantee from compact defense fleets, and the right to apply for full membership after a probationary period of 200 years. The Caith ambassador, Lyra, watched Calvin's face while Sulvereth spoke. She was younger than the others, with pale gold skin and large dark eyes, and she had spent 4 years studying humanity specifically. She had read their history. She had watched their broadcasts. She thought she understood them better than her colleagues did. She was watching Calvin because she wanted to see the moment the offer landed, the small shift in expression, the tension in the shoulders, the careful blinking that meant a species was processing something difficult. Calvin's face did not change at all. Sulvereth finished. The room was quiet. The hum of the station filled the silence like water filling a glass. Delegate Rowe, Sulvereth said, does your government have a response? Calvin looked down at the closed folder in front of him. Then he looked up at the 7 faces across the table. He did not look angry. He did not look nervous or hurt or impressed. He looked the way a man looks when he has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. He closed his folder. He set his pen on top of it. He folded his hands. "We decline," he said. The silence that followed was not a normal silence. It was the kind of silence that happens when something occurs that a room was not built to contain. The translator devices processed the words and delivered them in 7 different languages, and all 7 ambassadors heard the same thing, and for a moment not one of them moved. Sulvereth's sideways eyelids blinked twice. "I would ask the delegate to clarify." "There is nothing to clarify," Calvin said. His voice was even and quiet. "We decline the offer. This is a preliminary response," the Solon representative asked. Her voice carried a thin edge of disbelief that even the translator could not smooth away. "It is our final response," Calvin said. Laura Finch wrote something in her notebook. Garrett Pierce continued to look at the firewall. Sulvereth leaned forward slightly. He had the careful, measured movements of someone who had handled difficult negotiations for 6 decades and knew how to stay steady. "Delegate Rowe, the compact has extended this offer 3 times over 6 years. The terms before you represent the considered position of 7 sovereign civilizations. A refusal at this stage is our right," Calvin said simply. Another silence. Longer this time. The door ambassador had not spoken yet. He was old, ancient by the look of him, with dark ridged skin and eyes that were almost entirely white. He had said nothing since the session began, and he said nothing now. But Lyra noticed that he was watching Calvin with an expression she had never seen on a door face before. She did not have a word for it. It was somewhere between surprise and recognition, the look of someone who has read a very old story and suddenly realized they are living inside it. Calvin picked up his folder. He picked up his pen. He placed them both neatly into his briefcase and closed the clasp. Across the table, 7 of the most powerful diplomatic representatives in the known galaxy watched a human pack his bag. No one said anything, because none of them, not even Lyra, who had studied humanity the longest, had prepared for this. They had prepared for anger, for demands, for theatrical refusals, followed by requests for better terms. They had prepared for desperation and for pride and for the 100 variations of yes that a younger species might dress up as something else. They had not prepared for calm. Calvin stood. Laura closed her notebook and stood beside him. Garrett pushed his chair back, buttoned the top button of his jacket, and moved to the door without being asked. Calvin looked at the 7 ambassadors one last time. "Thank you for your time," he said, and he meant it in the most ordinary way possible, the way a person thanks someone for a meeting that simply did not produce the result either side was hoping for. Then the 3 humans walked out. The door closed behind them with a soft, final sound. In conference room 7, ambassadors sat around a long table and looked at the empty chairs across from them, and the conquered ring hummed on around them, and some were very far away on a blue planet that had been building ships in the dark. The rest of humanity went about its day without knowing yet what had just happened or what it was about to set in motion. Negotiations collapse. Humanity walks away, and the galaxy begins to fear what comes next. Solvarith did not panic. He had been a diplomat for 60 years, and he had learned long before his first gray hair appeared that the first rule of negotiation was never to let the other side see you panic. So he sat still for a full 30 seconds. After the door closed and he breathed slowly, and then he pressed the small button on the table that reopened the channel to the Compact's administrative relay. "The human delegation has temporarily withdrawn," he said into the relay, his voice smooth and even. "We expect them to return shortly with revised conditions." He believed that when he said it. He had no reason not to believe it. In the history of the Galactic Compact, no species had ever simply walked away from a membership offer. Some had delayed. Some had tried to renegotiate. A few had made dramatic exits and then sent a quiet communication the following morning asking if the table was still available. But no observed species, not one, had ever declined and actually meant it. In the corridor outside conference room 7, Calvin Rowe was walking at a steady pace toward the docking level. Laura Finch was beside him, her notebook tucked under her arm, her steps brisk and light. Garrett Pierce walked half a step behind, and to the right, the way he always did, out of old habit. The corridor was long and pale, lit from above by strips of soft light. They passed a group of Mar Avi staff members who stepped aside and stared as the humans went by. The Mar Avi were a small species, round-faced and curious, and they had never seen a species walk out of a compact session before. One of them said something quietly to another, but Calvin did not catch it and did not stop to ask. Back in the conference room, it took about 12 minutes for Sulverith to accept that the humans were not coming back on their own. He called the station's administrative office and asked calmly whether the human delegation had reached the docking level yet. The answer came back after a short pause. Yes, they had. They were aboard their ship. The docking clamps had been released. The vessel was preparing to depart. Sulverith stood up from his chair. This was noticeable because Sulverith had not stood up during a session in 11 years. Open a communication channel to the human vessel, he said. The channel opened. Calvin's voice came through, polite and unhurried, asking if there was something he could help with. Delegate Rowe, Sulverith said, and there was only the smallest crack in his careful tone. The compact is prepared to offer revised terms. The probationary period can be reduced to 150 years. Inspection rights would be limited to vessels entering compact controlled space only. These are significant concessions. A brief pause from Calvin's end. Thank you, Ambassador, Calvin said. Our position has not changed. Another pause. Sulverith's sideways eyelids blinked 3 times in quick succession, which, in Arth body language, was the equivalent of someone gripping the edge of a table. Delegate Arth, you are making a decision that cannot easily be reversed. The compact's offer has a window. If your government wishes to reconsider, we will let you know, Calvin said, and his voice carried no sarcasm and no warmth, just the simple, clean sound of a man who had said what he meant and did not feel the need to say it again. The channel closed. In the conference room, the 7 ambassadors looked at one another. The Fel representative made a sound that did not translate well, but that roughly meant something like, "This is not how it is supposed to go." The Solon representative was already composing an urgent message to her home government. The Ocean Collective's ambassador sat with her 4 hands folded on the table and stared at the door. Lyra On, the Kth ambassador, had pulled up her research files on her personal screen and was reading them again. Not because she had forgotten anything, but because she was looking for something she might have missed. Some note, some detail, some line in the historical record that explained this. Humans had fought for 200 years over the right to vote in their own governments. They had gone to war over trade routes and borders and ideas. They had never, in their entire recorded history, walked quietly away from something. Except that was not quite right, she thought. She found the line she was looking for. In the mid-20th century, by the human calendar, there was a period when certain groups of humans had practiced something called non-violent resistance. They had walked away from systems that treated them as less than equal. Not in fury, not in desperation, in the quiet, steady certainty that the system was wrong and that they did not have to accept it. She set the screen down. She looked at the empty chairs where the humans had been sitting. Then she did something no one expected. She stood up and said very clearly, "I need to speak with Delegate Rowe before his vessel leaves compact space." Sulverith looked at her. "Ambassador Lyra On, this is not the appropriate moment for..." "With respect," she said, "I do not think any of us know what the appropriate moment looks like anymore." She was already walking toward the door. She reached Calvin's vessel via emergency communication channel with 4 minutes to spare before it moved beyond The station's close-range relay. Distance. His face appeared on the screen, still. Calm, still unhurried, his briefcase. Presumably already stowed somewhere neat. And out of the way. Ambassador, he said with what sounded like genuine courtesy. Delegate Rowe, she said. She had prepared several careful, diplomatic things to say, and she abandoned all of them. If you leave, the compact cannot guarantee Earth's security. There are species in the outer reaches, species that are not members, that are not bound by compact law, that have been watching humanity for years. They have been waiting for a moment, exactly like this one. Calvin was quiet for a second or two. He looked at her the way someone looks at a person they respect but disagree with. Ambassador, he said, and his voice was not unkind. We spent 300 years fighting each other on a single planet. Every ocean, every continent, every mountain range and jungle and frozen tundra you can imagine. We didn't need your guarantee then. He paused, just for a moment. We don't need it now. The screen went dark. Lyra Ann stood in the empty side corridor of Concord Ring and listened to the station hum around her. After a while she walked back to Conference Room 7. The other ambassadors were still there, still talking, their voices low and tangled with disbelief. Somewhere in the compact's vast communication network, the diplomatic feeds that had been broadcasting the session to 42 civilizations were being replayed and discussed and argued over. Commentators were calling it a mistake, a bluff, a failure of human judgment, a breakdown in communication. Some called it reckless. A few called it sad. Nobody called it brave. Not yet. That word would come later, from places no one expected. In the outer corridors of Concord Ring, a group of auction maintenance workers had gathered around a wall screen, showing the replay of the session. They watched Calvin close his briefcase. They watched the three humans stand up. They watched the door close. One of the workers, a young auction who had been born on a world under compact inspection protocol and had never in her life seen the inside of a Tier 2 technology facility, watched the replay 3 times. She did not say anything to her colleagues. She went back to work, but she kept thinking about it for the rest of the day and for a long time after, and she would not have been able to say exactly why it made her feel the way it did. The human vessel cleared compact relay range at 1400 station time. It left no message. It sent no follow-up communication. It simply went, steady and quiet, back in the direction of the small, distant star where a blue planet was waiting. In Conference Room 7, Solvarith finally sat back down. He looked at the table for a long time. Then he said in a very quiet voice, to no one in particular, what do they want to? Nobody answered him, because nobody knew. And that, more than anything else that had happened that day, was what would keep them awake that night, always. And the galaxy begins to fear what comes next. The news reached Earth before Calvin's ship did. The diplomatic feeds were faster than any human vessel, and by the time the footage of the walkout was picked up and distributed across Earth's global networks, it had already been watched 60 million times on the Compact's own relay systems. On Earth, it was watched a great deal more than that. People were not calm about it at first. The first 2 weeks were loud. News programs ran the footage in loops. Opinion writers wrote long, complicated pieces about diplomatic catastrophe. Politicians who had never been to space and never negotiated anything more difficult than a budget session stood in front of cameras and talked about recklessness. Protests appeared outside the Foreign Affairs building in 3 different cities. A former trade minister gave an interview in which she called Calvin Rose's decision the single greatest act of diplomatic irresponsibility in human history. Calvin was in a hotel room in Geneva. When he watched that interview, he turned it off and went to sleep. The Congressional Oversight Committee summoned him 4 days after his return. The chamber was full. The cameras were on. The committee chairman, a large, gray-haired man named Senator Douglas Hale, leaned over his microphone and looked at Calvin the way a disappointed father looks at a son who has done something spectacular and terrible at the same time. Delegate Rowe, Senator Hale said, "Please explain to this committee and to the people watching at home what exactly happened aboard Concord Ring." Calvin sat alone at the witness table. He had a glass of water and a single sheet of paper. He looked up at the row of faces watching him, and then he said quietly, "I would like to read the terms of the compact's offer into the record." Senator Hale nodded. Calvin read them out, one by one, in a flat and careful voice. No voting rights. No technology access. Mandatory inspection of all military vessels. 10% of Earth's annual economic output paid into a fund controlled entirely by the Compact's Administrative Council. Right to apply for full membership after 200 years. The chamber got quieter with each item. By the time Calvin finished reading, it was very quiet indeed. He set the paper down. "That is what we were being asked to accept," he said. "Not as a starting point for negotiation. As a final offer after 6 years and 3 sessions." Senator Hale was silent for a moment. Then he said, "And you felt that walking away without a counter-offer was the appropriate response?" "I felt," Calvin said, "that the appropriate response to being told your civilization is worth 200 years of probation and 10% of everything you make is to make clear that you disagree." The chamber was still quiet. Somewhere in the back rows someone started clapping. It spread. It was not unanimous. The chamber was never unanimous about anything, but it was loud enough and long enough that the chairman had to call for order twice. The ratification vote came 3 weeks later. It passed by a wide margin. Dr. Laura Finch went back to her office at the university and wrote a paper about the session that became, over the following months, one of the most widely translated documents in human history. She did not write it as a celebration. She wrote it as an analysis, careful, detailed, and honest about the risks. She concluded it with one sentence that got quoted more than anything else she had ever written: "We did walk away from the table because we were strong. We walked away because we finally understood that we were." Garrick Pierce received a promotion. He accepted it with a handshake and went back to work. Across the compact, things were shifting in ways that were hard to see all at once, but very clear when you stepped back and looked at the full picture. The Moravi foreign minister watched the footage of the walkout 4 times. She was a careful woman who had held her position for 22 years, and she did not do things impulsively. On the 5th viewing, she called in her senior staff and asked them to prepare a full report on the terms of the Compact's associate member agreement and how they compared to what a full member received. The report came back in 8 days. She read it in one sitting and then sat quietly in her office for a long time before scheduling a meeting with her planet's legislative council. The Aukin Collective's ambassador, the woman who had sat with her 4 hands folded on the table watching the humans leave, went home and asked her own government for something she had never asked for before, a review of the inspection protocols that had been applied to Aukin military vessels for the past 80 years. She did not say the humans had inspired her. She said she felt it was time for a second look among the species that had been associate members of the Compact for generations, species that had accepted 200-year probationary periods and tides and inspections without much complaint. Because the Compact was strong and the galaxy was large and frightening, the footage of Calvin Rowe packing his briefcase traveled quietly from screen to screen, passed along in messages that did not say very much out loud but said quite a lot between the lines. But it was what was happening in human space that troubled the Compact's intelligence networks the most. Earth was not doing what a species was supposed to do after failing to join the Compact. It was not sending quiet diplomatic messages asking for another session. It was not making public statements about its commitment to peaceful integration. It was not, as far as anyone could tell, worried. It was building. New shipyard structures appeared in orbit around Mars. The signatures were enormous, not warship scale but not civilian scale either. Something in between, or something new entirely. Around the moons of Jupiter, construction drones worked in steady, patient shifts around the clock. In the asteroid belt, mining operations that had been running at 60% capacity for years suddenly went to full output and stayed there. The Compact sent a routine observation satellite to monitor the activity from a respectful distance. It collected data for 3 weeks and sent back a report that the Compact's technology analysts spent 2 days arguing about because several of the drive signatures being tested in the outer system did not match anything in their databases. Earth's communication networks, which had previously been rather open, humans broadcast quite a lot almost carelessly, began to change. Certain channels went quiet. Certain data stopped flowing outward. It was not the silence of a civilization that was afraid or hiding. It was the silence of a civilization that had decided it did not need to share everything anymore. Admiral Corazons was the commander of Earth's restructured deep space fleet. She was a compact woman with short, silver hair and the kind of eyes that looked at everything the same way, with full and level attention, whether she was looking at a star chart or at a person who was trying to figure her out. She gave one interview during this period to a journalist named Pete Harlan, who had covered space affairs for 15 years and who later wrote that interviewing her was like trying to read a wall. Admiral Pete asked, "The Compact has expressed concern about the pace of human shipyard construction. How would you respond to that?" Cora looked at him for a moment. "We are expanding our fleet," she said. "Is that a response to the failed negotiations?" "It is a response to the needs of our civilization," she said. "Are you preparing for conflict?" She looked at him again, the same full, level look. We are not preparing for war, she said. Then she said nothing else. Pete waited. She waited longer. He eventually moved on to his next question. The interview ran in full. That line, we are not preparing for war, got pulled out and repeated. Everywhere in every language the compact translated it into, and in every language it landed with a slightly different weight. Because she had said what they were not doing. She had not said what they were doing. And in the gap between those two things, the galaxy's various intelligence agencies built entire departments trying to figure out the answer. In the Dor Elder Assembly, the oldest deliberative body in the known galaxy, a session was convened that was not listed on the public schedule. The Dor were not a dramatic species. They were slow and careful, and they thought in centuries the way humans thought in years. They had watched civilizations rise and crumble and rise again, and they had learned not to be easily surprised. They were surprised now. The summary of that session was sealed, but a single line was leaked 3 months later through channels no one ever fully traced. It was translated into 31 languages and debated on 100 worlds. In its most common English translation, it read, "We taught them nothing. They learned everything anyway." Now we are at the part of the story where we find out what that means. On Earth, Calvin Rowe went back to teaching. He graded papers. He answered student emails. He made coffee in the morning and read the news the way he always had, carefully and without rushing. His students said he seemed the same as he always had. His colleagues said the same. Only Laura, who had known him for years, noticed the small, quiet thing that had changed in him, not pride exactly and not satisfaction, but something close to both. The sense of a man who had said a true thing and watched the world begin, slowly and uncertainly, to understand it. Negotiations collapse. Humanity walks away and the galaxy begins to fear what comes next. The courier ship was small and plain. It was registered to a trade company that mostly moved dry goods between Keth border worlds, and there was nothing about it that would draw a second look from anyone scanning the shipping lanes. It docked at Luna Station on a Tuesday morning local time, and the only person who got off was a young Keth analyst with a travel bag over one shoulder and a translation device clipped to his collar. His name was Voss Keel. He was 29 years old by his own species calendar, which put him somewhere around 35 in human terms. He had pale gold skin, large dark eyes, and the slightly dazed expression of someone who had been reading about a place for years and was now unexpectedly standing in it. He had been sent by his government. Not officially, there was no documentation, no diplomatic registry, no formal designation. Officially, Voss Keel was on personal travel leave. Unofficially, 6 senior members of the Keth Foreign Affairs Council had sat in a room together for 3 hours and decided that someone needed to go to Earth and talk to the humans and try, very carefully, to figure out what they actually wanted. They chose Voss Keel because he had spent 4 years studying humanity. He spoke passable English. He had read more human history than any other analyst in the department. And he was young enough, one of the council members had noted, with the particular kind of practicality that comes with great age, that if he said something wrong, it could be called a Personal mistake rather than government position. He sent a message to Dr. Laura Finch before leaving Keth Space. It was short and honest. He said he was a researcher interested in Earth contact relations, that he was not there in any official capacity, and that he would very much like to talk if she was willing. He said he would understand if she was not. Laura wrote back the same day. She suggested a cafeteria on Luna Station civilian level, the one near the Botanical Garden section at 10:00 in the morning. She said she would bring coffee. Voskul arrived 7 minutes early. He sat at a table near the window that looked out over the hydroponic section and watched humans move through the corridors outside and tried to remember everything he had read about them, and found that it was not quite enough to prepare him for the reality of seeing them in person. They were softer looking than he expected, most of them rounder. They laughed a lot. They touched each other frequently, a hand on an arm, a shoulder briefly, squeezed in ways that his own species reserved for close family. Laura arrived exactly on time with 2 cups of coffee, one of which she set in front of him without asking whether he drank it. He did not, as it happened, but he held the cup and appreciated the gesture, the way she clearly intended it, as an act of ordinary, uncomplicated welcome. She was not what he had pictured from her professional biography. She was smaller than the photo suggested, and more relaxed. She sat across from him and looked at him with the clear, open attention of someone who was genuinely curious and not performing it. "You came a long way," she said. "Yes," he said. "And your government doesn't know you're here." He paused. "My government sent me here," he said, carefully, in a way that allows them to say they did not. Laura nodded, as if this was completely sensible. "All right," she said. "What do you want to know?" He had prepared a list of careful, diplomatic questions. He looked at her and set the list aside. Mentally, "My government and the compact cannot understand what you want," he said. After the walkout, "You have not made demands. You have not issued threats. You have not sent any communication requesting a resumption of talks. By every model we have for how species behave after a failed negotiation, humanity is doing something we do not have a category for." Laura wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "What does your model say we should be doing?" "Either preparing to re-engage, probably from a position of desperation as economic pressure builds, or preparing for some form of conflict. Our analysts cannot find evidence of either. What they find instead is," he paused, searching for the word, "industry, construction, quiet." "And that frightens you," Laura said. He considered denying it. He did not. "Yes," he said. Laura looked out the window at the hydroponic section for a moment. A technician was moving between the plant rows, making adjustments. Unhurried. "Can I tell you something about humans?" she said. "That is why I am here. We have a very particular relationship with being underestimated," she said. "It is one of the longest-running experiences in our history. Groups of people, entire populations, being told they were less capable, less worthy, less ready. And the thing that those populations did consistently and across centuries and cultures was not collapse. It was not rage most of the time. It was work. Quiet, patient, steady work toward the thing they had been told they could not have. Vasco was very still. The compact told us we needed 200 years. To prove ourselves, Laura said. We've been building spacecraft for less than 200 years. We went from our first powered flight to landing on our own moon in 66 years. 66. And your council wanted 200 just to let us sit at the table. She looked at him. We didn't leave because we were angry. We left because that offer told us very clearly that the compact did not understand what it was dealing with, and we decided we would rather spend the time making sure they found out. Vasco was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at the coffee cup in his hands. What would bring your government back to negotiations, he said. It was the question his government had sent him to ask. He had expected to work up to it. Gradually, it came out directly because the conversation had made the careful approach feel dishonest. Laura looked at him without blinking. An equal chair, she said. Not in 150 years. Not after inspections and tides in probationary reviews. Now, full membership, full vote, full access, the same seat at the table that every other member has. The compact's founding members would resist that strongly, he said. I know, Laura said. It could take years to bring them to that position. I know that too, Laura said. She picked up her coffee. But you didn't come here to tell me what is easy, and I didn't agree to meet you to tell you what is comfortable. You asked what we want. That is what we want. Vasco returned to Keth Space with a full written report that he delivered in person to the 6 council members who had sent him. He sat in the council room, which was formal and cold and smelled of old stone, and he read the report aloud and then answered questions for 2 hours. At the end, the most senior council member, a woman so old her gold skin had gone almost white, leaned forward and asked him one question. Do you believe them? She said. Do you believe they will simply wait? Vasco thought about the cafeteria. He thought about the technician moving unhurried through the plant rows. He thought about the shipyard signatures. Their satellites had been tracking, steady and growing week after week. Yes, he said. I believe them entirely. The report circulated, not just within the Keth government, through channels that Vasco did not fully trace. Pieces of it reached other capitals, other councils. Within 6 weeks of his return, 3 compact member species had filed requests with Earth's diplomatic office for independent trade discussions, separate from any compact framework. Earth's diplomatic office replied to all 3 politely, promptly, without urgency. In the Door Elder Assembly, the sealed session that had produced the leaked line about humanity learning without being taught was followed by a second session and then a third. The Door did not act quickly. They never had. But they were thinking slowly and seriously in the way that a species thinks when it has finally encountered something it cannot file away in an existing category. Lyra on back in her own office on the Keth homeworld pinned Vasco's report to her wall and read it every morning. Before starting work, she had been the one who had tried to stop Calvin at the door with talk of out-of-reach threats, and she thought about the conversation often. She had offered them fear as a reason to stay. He had answered with history. She understood now what she had missed. She had been studying humanity long enough to know the facts of what they were. She had not understood until the door closed and that calm voice said, "We don't need it now," what those facts actually meant when they were standing in the same room as you. The galaxy had spent 6 years watching humanity try to join a club. It was only now beginning to understand that what it was actually watching was something else entirely, a civilization, finishing the long, quiet work of deciding what it was so that when the moment came, it would know exactly what it was worth, and it would not settle for less. Negotiations collapse. Humanity walks away and the galaxy begins to fear what comes next. The envelope arrived at Earth's orbital diplomatic office on a Wednesday. It was not a physical envelope. Of course, it came through the standard relay system as an encrypted data packet, but whoever had prepared it had formatted it with the kind of careful, formal structure that made it feel like something you might hold in your hands. It had a header with seals on it. It had been signed. It had been, in every way that mattered, composed with the weight of people who understood that some communications need to feel like what they are. The staff member who received it read the header twice, then called her supervisor. Her supervisor read it and called the department head. The department head read it and called Calvin Rowe. Calvin was in the middle of marking undergraduate papers when his phone rang. He answered it, listened for about 40 seconds and said, "Send it to my personal address." Then he went back to marking papers for another 10 minutes because the student whose essay he was reading had made an interesting argument and he did not want to lose his place. Then he opened the message. It was signed by 4 of the 7 compact member species. Not the compact as a whole, that was the first thing he noticed. Not a compact document with 7 seals. 4 individual signatures, the CAF, the Ocean Collective, the Marebi, and at the bottom, quiet and without comment, the door who had not made an unsolicited diplomatic move in over a century. Calvin read the document slowly. It was not long. It did not need to be. The offer was simple and it was clear. And it was, in almost every meaningful way, the opposite of what had been placed on the table in conference room 7 1 year ago. Full membership. Full voting rights. No tithe. No inspection protocol for human vessels. No probationary period. In return, humanity would join a mutual defense clause, the clause every full member had always been required to join, and would enter a technology exchange framework that ran in both directions, gradually and by mutual agreement. Calvin set the document down. He looked out his office window at the gray afternoon sky and the oak tree in the courtyard that had lost most of its leaves. He sat like that for a while. Then he picked up his phone and called Laura Finch. She picked up on the second ring. He did not say hello. He said, "Check your messages." A pause. He heard the small sounds of her finding it and opening it. Then a long silence. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. Another silence. "The door," she said. "I noticed that too," he said. "Calvin," she said, "the door haven't signed anything unsolicited since before our great-grandparents were born." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her thinking. "Who do we call first?" she said. "Garrett," he said. "And then Cora." He called Colonel, now General Garrett. Pierce, who read the document in the time it took most people to read a paragraph, and said, in his unhurried way, "Send it forward. I'll back whatever the committee decides." Then he was quiet for a second and added, "They came to us. It was not quite a question." "They did," Calvin said. "Good," Garrett said, and hung up. Calvin called Admiral Cora Vince's office. Her aide answered, put him on hold for less than a minute, and then Cora's voice came through, sharp and clear, with the low hum of the Fleet Command station behind it. "Rowe," she said. "Admiral," he said, "I'm forwarding you something." He heard the soft sounds of her reading. The station hummed. He waited. "Full rights," she said. "No conditions." "Effectively, yes," he said. A pause. Then a sound that might have been a quiet laugh, but with Corazon it was always difficult to be sure. "How long did it take them?" she said. 1 year, Calvin said. "We spent 6 years asking," she said. "And 1 year not asking. That seems to be the relevant data point," Calvin said. Another pause. "Forward it to the Oversight Committee," she said. "Tell them I recommend acceptance. You don't want to negotiate further." "Calvin," she said, and her voice carried something in it, not warmth exactly, not pride exactly, but the settled weight of someone who has carried a thing a long way and can finally see where it is going to land. "We already negotiated the day we walked out the door. The ratification process took 4 months. There were hearings, of course, and there were arguments. There were always arguments, and there were opposition. Voices that called it reckless, and voices that called it incomplete, and voices that wanted more time to study the technology exchange framework." Calvin sat through all of it with the same expression he had worn in Conference Room 7, the one that gave nothing away and needed to give nothing away because the facts were clear enough to speak without his help. The vote passed. Not unanimously, it never would have been unanimous, and no one expected it to be, but by a margin large enough that the result was never in real doubt. On a Thursday morning in early spring, with pale sunlight on the steps of the Foreign Affairs Building and a press conference that the journalists later complained was too short and too plain, humanity formally joined the Galactic Compact as a full member. Calvin read a short statement. He thanked the committee and the diplomatic staff in the oversight process. He said that humanity looked forward to contributing to the compact and to learning from its members and to the work ahead. He did not use the historic. He did not use the word triumph. He said what was true and what was needed, and then he stepped away from the podium and let the moment be what it was, without dressing it in anything extra. Laura watched from the side of the room and wrote nothing in her notebook. She had already written what she needed to write. Garrett Pierce watched from the back row and said nothing, which was what he usually did. On the Keth homeworld, Vasquez watched the broadcast in his small office with a cup of something warm in his hands that was not coffee, but that he drank in the mornings, now out of a habit he had picked up from a cafeteria on Luna Station. He watched Calvin step away from the podium, and he felt something that he later tried to write about and could not quite find the words for in his own language. He found it eventually in English. He wrote it in his personal notes, the particular feeling of watching someone be proven right about themselves in the Compact's vast archive system, were the entry of every new member. Species was recorded in the ancient, formal language that had been used since the compact's founding. There existed a standard phrase for the occasion. It was warm and ceremonial. It translated loosely as the arrival of the expected. It had been used for over 300 member species from the earliest days of the compact to the present, and it was considered a mark of welcome. The door elder who filed humanity's entry record was the oldest member of the oldest deliberative body in the known galaxy. She had been present at 11 species entry ceremonies. She had used the standard phrase 11 times. She knew it by memory in 7 languages. She did not use it for humanity. She sat at her desk in the archive chamber with its old stone walls and its long rows of sealed data columns stretching into the dark, and she thought carefully for a long time. Then she typed a different word. It was an old word, older than the compact itself, pulled from a language that predated most of the member species' recorded histories. It had appeared in the archive only twice before, both times in records so old they required specialist tools to read. In most translations, it meant the arrival of the one you were not ready for. She filed the record. She sealed it. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the archive chamber and thought about the footage she had watched: a man closing a briefcase, 3 humans walking through a door, a corridor going quiet, and she thought about everything that had come after it in 1 year, all the building, and the silence and the waiting, and the 4 signatures on a document that had traveled across the stars to knock on a door that humanity had closed. Then she turned off her screen and went home because it was late and the work was done, and some moments are simply what they are and do not need to be made larger than the truth of them. On Earth, Calvin Rowe went back to teaching on Monday. He graded papers. He answered student emails. He made coffee in the morning. The oak tree in the courtyard had started to grow new leaves.